This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. What comes to mind when you hear the question, what were your teenage years like? Do you shudder or cringe? Or maybe you think back on those years with fondness and have a sense of nostalgia. I feel a mix of all those feelings, along with isolation, pressure, and a desire to fit in. New York Times bestselling author Celeste Ng explores all of those themes in her 2014 novel, Everything I Never Told You, which has become a popular title on high school reading lists. The story follows a Chinese-American family in 1970s small-town Ohio as they try to understand the death of the oldest daughter. Told from various perspectives of each grieving family member, the story alternates between past and present, and you learn alongside each person as they come to realize how little they know about the people they thought they knew best. I sat down with Celeste Ng in May at Simsbury High School for an event called Make Us Count. Students participated in conversations about Asian and Asian American representation and the power of storytelling when it comes to identity and belonging. My fellow moderator was Ben Cash, a senior at Simsbury High. We started the conversation by asking Celeste why she decided to start her novel with the haunting line, "Lydia is dead, but they don't know this yet."
Well, I will tell you a secret, which is that originally that was not even the first line of the novel. Originally, the characters in the book didn't know what had happened to Lydia, and neither did the reader. It wasn't until about 20 or 30 pages in that you found out that Lydia had drowned and that the characters also sort of realized what was going on. And it was, I think, on the third draft of the novel where it wasn't working. I had asked a friend to read it. I was talking with them, and they said, is there a good reason that you're holding back this information? Is there a reason that the reader shouldn't know right at the beginning what happened to Lydia? And as soon as she asked that, I realized, oh, crap, there is not. I should just tell the reader what happened so that they know right up front what's going to happen. And I realized that if the reader knew right away something more than the characters knew, that put them in the position of realizing that all of these characters had blind spots, had things that they didn't know about, had things that they were keeping from each other. It put the reader in the position of being able to put together the pieces in a way that the characters couldn't. And I realized that that connected to the themes of disconnect and the themes of secrecy. And so I realized that was what needed to happen at the beginning of the novel. So it really was thanks to my friend that became the first line of the novel, and I think that it helped pull the whole book together.
Well, in that book, Everything I Never Told You and also Little Fires Everywhere, they're both novels that have a very strong focus on families and adolescence. And I'm curious to hear, is there a reason why you feel the importance of centering on families and adolescents? And you just mentioned now that putting the reader in certain positions helps the reader understand the story a little bit better. So is that the thought processes behind it?
That's part of it. I think of adolescence and young adulthood as a really important period of time. I remember what it was like to be an adolescent when I was growing up. I'm not sure that I know exactly what it's like now, but there are certain things that I think are probably always going to be the case for people around the age of middle school, high school, young adulthood. You're given a lot of responsibility, but you're not given a lot of agency. It's a time in which I think you're encountering the rules of the world for the first time, and you have to figure out how you're going to operate within those systems or if you're going to push back against them. It's also a period where I think that the lens of your world is opening up a lot. When you're a child, if you're lucky, your world is pretty small. It's maybe your family, maybe your close friends, maybe right around your neighborhood. You get a little bit older and you realize there's other families out there and they do things differently than you do. And then when you become an adult, your lens opens up even wider and you realize that there's lots of places in the world. There have been lots of eras in time. You realize that there's actually a lot more picture outside the frame than you thought there was. And so that period where that lens is first starting to open up and you're starting to realize, oh, just because my family always did it this way, or it's always been this way in my family, doesn't mean that's the only way to be. And so for me, that's a really important moment of awakening and of figuring out how you're going to be in that world. So I think that's why I'm really drawn to write about it.
One of the powerful themes in Everything I Never Told You is how people can deeply love one another, yet still fail to truly see each other. Why do you think that happens so often within families, schools, and communities?
Yeah, this is the big question of life, right? I'm thinking about this because, I've been a daughter. Both of my parents have passed away, but I'm now a mother. And I'm realizing how many things my parents knew that they didn't share with me. Not necessarily because they were ashamed or because they were keeping secrets from me, but just because it never came up. And I'm trying to think now, what is it that I want to pass on to my son? And so I think this is just a big part of the human experience of what do we share with each other? How do we get to know each other? We take for granted a lot of times that, people know that. I don't need to say that to them. And a lot of times, the cliche is saying, I love you. I don't need to say it because they already know, right? But you also know if you ever hear those words, it does mean quite a lot to get to hear them. And so thinking about how we sometimes let things go unsaid or how we don't say them because we're afraid of how other people react, for me that feels like a very human thing and something that I negotiate a lot in my own life, and I think that's how it comes out in my writing.
Well, I love that you bring up the phrase "I love you" because you think it's a very normal thing to say to somebody if you love them. But I'm also sort of unpacking the love language of how Asian or Asian American parents express that. And so I don't know about you or anyone in the audience, but I think how my parents express love is, here's a plate of cut fruit.
Yeah.
Right? Versus "I love you." And it really makes me think as an adult today that you don't necessarily need to hear your parents say the words "I love you." Sometimes the action is actually more powerful than the verbal, but it also took me about 20 years to figure that out, right?
I think that's exactly right. I had a similar thing. When I was in college, my dad would send me these care packages that contain those little Hunt snack packs of chocolate pudding. And I'm like, Dad, I could have bought this at the store here. You did not need to mail this to me in a large box. And it took me quite a long time to realize what he was actually saying with that, right? And so when I talk about, saying I love you, I don't necessarily mean saying those words, but I mean saying it in whatever action or whatever way and having it be heard. I think that's the key, and realizing that people express these things different ways and figuring out what it is that they're actually saying, I think is such an important thing. And the stakes are much higher the more that you care about somebody. There's the sense that if you are very close to them, if it's your parent, your sibling, your best friend, someone that you expect to be close to, if there's something that you feel like you don't know about them, it can feel like a bigger betrayal. And so the stakes are just much higher in trying to get those lines of communication clear.
So for many Asian American students, there can be pressure to stay quiet, achieve, or avoid disappointing others. How do silence and unspoken expectations affect identity and mental well-being?
I think that is very true for Asian American students. I think it's true for students overall, but it can be particularly strong for Asian American students, partly for cultural reasons. And partly for, I guess, what I'll call family history reasons. Speaking just for myself, my parents really wanted me and my sister to achieve. So they were always pushing us, do your best. It was the stereotype of, if you got a 98, what happened to those other 2 points? Go back, find out what you did, redo the assignment. And I thought at first this was just because my parents were overly demanding. And I think that they did have very high standards. But I think there was more to it. As I got older, I thought, well, this is an Asian thing. It's because Asian parents only care about this. They really wanted me to go into the sciences. And from an early age, I think it was clear that that was not where my interest lay. And I'm really happy that they let me go my own way. But for a long time, I thought it's Asian parents only want you to be a doctor or go into business. They don't care about anything else. They don't care about writing. And as I got a little older, I realized that wasn't true for my family. My house was crammed full of books. That's how I became such a bookworm. For fun, my parents would take me to the bookstore and we'd all spend a couple hours, and when I'd come back, I'd have a stack of books, and I'd never remember them saying no to a book that I wanted to read. Same thing when we go to the library. And I realized it wasn't that they didn't care about books either. So what was it? And I think for them, a lot of it really came from being immigrants. And for them, the way that they had been treated as immigrants. They were both scientists. My dad was a physicist and my mom was a chemist. And I think they wanted me to go into the sciences not because they didn't think that the arts were important, not because they didn't think I could do it, not any of that, but because they knew that they didn't know that world. And I think they were worried that they wouldn't be able to help me. They understood how you do science. You go to the lab, you do these things, you get a PhD, you get a postdoc, then you go, you have these paths. And for them, when I said I was going to go and be an English major, I think for them, it was like I said, I'm just going to sail right off the map that you know. I'm going to go right into the part where there are dragons and wish me luck. And for them, I think that was really hard. The other thing that I think was part of that was I think that they understood better than I did what kind of barriers I might face. They were in what they call the hard sciences, right, where often there is a correct answer or there's something that you can verify. You can prove that you did this right. That's part of the science that they do, right? Somebody else can do it and get the same answer, and you see that they did it correctly. And I think they realized that if I was going into the field of writing, which is very subjective, there could be any number of reasons that people would say, no, that's not right. You didn't do it right. That's not good enough. There was no objective measure where they could say I was right? And I think they knew that it was going to be a really hard path for somebody like me to go into this very, very subjective field. And so I think that a lot of that pressure, to go back to your question, Ben, was really coming not from a cultural thing necessarily. Anyone who knows anything about Asian cultures, broadly speaking, knows there's tons of art, there's tons of all these things. But it really had to do with them feeling like they had struggled really hard in where they were and in their fields and wanting things to be easier for me. And so I think a lot of times we're told the stereotype is, well, Asians only care about math and science. It's only if you're a doctor. And it actually is a lot more complicated than that. Yeah, it's a great question.
You don't want me to be your doctor. I can already start by saying that.
I was thinking the same. I would make a terrible doctor, honestly. The people who are doctors, all power to them, but it takes a certain kind of person. And yeah, I think you have to figure out what kind of person you actually are and then find the thing that you're good at. And I'm so grateful, honestly, that my parents let me kind of go and find my way into the thing that I'm somewhat good at.
And it's so great to be able to share that story, right? Because that's one of a bajillion different Asians or Asian American stories that someone may not have ever heard of. And I also have parents that I think very, very early on, very similar story, they realized that there's no way I can go into STEM. Not because of there's no interest. I actually did have interest, but I did not have the grades or the brains to do that. So now I get to talk about it, which is also very awesome.
I was the other way around, which is that I was good at STEM, and it was interesting enough, but I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do. I was given so many kits where you could make a robot, make a microphone that lets your voice come out on the radio, all these things, and I did them and they worked. But then as soon as I was done with them, I used them to tell radio stories. I would okay, listen to the story that I read. I'm going to broadcast it over the radio. And so I think it was clear for them early on, that's who she is.
Well, and I want to build on what Ben just asked earlier too about wanting to avoid disappointing others. And there's these assumptions, and we've heard a lot about the model minority myth today and how there's so much invisibility that happens when you are Asian or Asian American. So I want to ask you in terms of language, because I'm going to be honest and say that I don't think I really understood what the model minority myth was until maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And that's very recent in my personal history. And it's because of what's been going on in the world. So how did you find language to be able to convey how you're feeling? And especially this idea that we're all learning today, how important storytelling is to tell those different perspectives.
Oh, that's a big question. I'm thinking about that phrase, the model minority myth in general, or that idea of the model minority. And I think the first time that I became aware of it was there was like a Time magazine cover, because my parents subscribed to Time, and so it would show up in our mailbox every week, that was brought up the idea of the model minority. And I remember that my mom actually like tore it out and saved it and had me read it and then sent it to my sister because she felt like this was something important to talk about. And I don't think I understood at the time sort of what it meant. I was like, that sounds great. We're the model. What's the problem? And it wasn't until I got older, and I would say certainly well through college, that I started realizing that that idea of being the model can be really harmful. And so I think, like you, it was maybe only certainly within the past 10 years that I've started to think about this idea in a more complicated way, that when you're being held up as the model, it means that there's only the one story that, like, you are the example of this, and so this is what you represent to everybody, and if that doesn't happen to match your experience or who you are or what it is that you want to do, then you don't fit in somehow. I think for me, that process of figuring out the language is still really evolving, because the more that we talk about not just Asian American issues, but also general issues of belonging, the more that I learn, for example, about the history of Black struggle or Latino-Latina struggle, the more I see commonalities, and the more that I start to understand things that I thought were just about Asian Americans are actually part of a broader struggle. And so for me, that vocabulary and that way of thinking about where Asians fit into this picture is really sort of still developing.
You're listening to Celeste Ng, New York Times bestselling author of Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere. Simsbury High senior Ben Cash is co-moderating the conversation with me. After the break, we'll dig deeper into the role literature plays when it comes to empathy, compassion, and understanding. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're listening back to our conversation with New York Times bestselling author Celeste Ng. We recently spoke at Simsbury High School for an event focused on the power of storytelling when it comes to representation. Celeste is the author of Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere, both novels with very strong focuses on families and adolescence. My co-moderator, Simsbury High School senior Ben Cash, asked Celeste about character building.
Your characters often carry private fears, loneliness, or shame that others cannot see. Why is it important for literature to make those invisible emotions visible?
Well, I think that's one of the things that literature can do that is really important. It's one of the few places where you can really get into someone else's head. You can really think their thoughts. You can really feel their feelings if the author's doing their job right. And if you've ever had a time where you felt like you were the only one that felt this way, the only one who had experienced this, the only one who was worried about this, the only one who looked like you in this area, or the only one who was, insert whatever you want in the blank here, feeling that you're not alone is a huge, huge relief and a huge comfort. Since we've been talking about Asian American issues particularly, I grew up in areas where there were very few other Asians. So until the age of 9, I lived outside of Pittsburgh, and the only Asian people that I knew were people in my family and the Korean lady who owned the Asian food store. And when I was able to see other aspects of Asian American life, Asian American experience in books, that felt really huge to me. Even though those characters weren't experiencing the same thing, I was like, oh, hey, there's other people like me out there. This is amazing. I didn't know that. This happened over and over, not just with ethnicity, but also with, oh, I thought I was the only one who felt like sort of this awkward weirdo who doesn't want to go to parties and is not social and is definitely not the popular, butterfly going to, every school group and making friends kind of kid. I'm the weirdo who sits in the corner and listens to everybody and then goes home and writes poetry. And when I got to encounter those people in books, it was a huge relief. I was like, oh, I'm not the only one, and maybe this is okay. So I think for someone who has experienced something in their own lives that they haven't gotten to see in the world, when they get to see that in books, it can be incredibly affirming. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it can be life-saving in sometimes. And that allows them, hopefully, to feel comfortable about who they are. That's, I think, maybe one of the most important things that literature can do for us.
When building on that too and following the thread that Ben just shared here and what you just said, is this idea of learning about empathy and understanding for each other through fiction. And I think there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about why does fiction matter? Why does representation in fiction matter? Why should we care about this, right? So kind of building on what you just shared, can you expand more on that in terms of, why is it important for us to read widely and read diversely and perhaps read out of your comfort zone? And then on top of that, pick up genres from authors that you may not expect to have written that genre.
So just that's all.
I answered my own question.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important question and one that I think, we could talk about for hours. There's one theory of what literature can do is it's often described as being, it can be a window or a mirror. So what I was just talking about, I think, was largely about the idea of it being a mirror, meaning that you can see yourself reflected in the story, and that's really important. The other thing that literature can do is it can act as a window into a place that you hadn't seen before. And so if wherever you are in the world isn't showing you certain things, you can experience that through literature. And when you know that exists, it's kind of a proof of concept. You're like, okay, this is a space where my world has gotten a little bit bigger. My idea about what the world could be like just expanded a little bit. If you're reading fiction, it says right on the cover, right on the title page, this is fiction, right? Which ostensibly means this didn't happen, these people didn't exist, all this is made up. But when you're reading it, you're saying, what if this did happen? What if these people did exist? What if the world was like this? What if someone had these experiences? And asking that what if, I think, is really important because it makes you it's like a doorstop being stuck in the door. It opens up a little bit of space for new ideas to come in. And if you don't have those new ideas coming in, then your view of what the world is really, really limited. If you have never seen anything other than what's right in front of your face, you can imagine how difficult it would be to react or to respond to other people who are there.
So our students have been creating oral histories and documentaries centered on representation and belonging. Why do personal stories often create deeper emotional understanding than statistics or just headlines?
This is a great question because I feel like often when you're writing a paper or when you're reading a news article, there's always these numbers that come in where they're like X% of people do this, or 3 in 4 people do this, or 20,000 people X, Y, and Z. And at least for me, I have a very difficult time imagining what 20,000 people looks like. I know what it means if 3 in 5 people say something, but a lot of times those figures they hit us in the rational part of our brain. And stories, whether they are fictional or whether they are personal stories, I think they kind of bypass that rational part of our brain and they kind of snake around and they get at your emotions in a way that numbers sometimes can't. So you can hear a story or a statistic saying 1 in 4 women will experience sexual assault. And you can think, well, that's a high percentage, that's terrible, that's awful, we should do something about this. If a person that you know comes to you and says, hey, here is a thing that happened to me, I was assaulted, that has much more of an impact because this is a person that you know, right? It puts a face to it, it puts it on a human level. And I think that we can't discount how important it is to be interacting with each other as humans and to hear some person who's in front of you say, this is a thing that happened to me. I think that's really, really important.
And so there's a lot of things going on in the world right now, of course, and I think sometimes it can be really overwhelming. And oftentimes we turn to stories, we turn to novels, whatever you're reading, graphic novels, comics, those all constitute reading. For us, audiobooking.
That counts as reading, for sure.
I will absolutely die on that hill. And so with sort of that in mind, What gives you hope when you see young people continuing working on art, continuing to write, whether it's poetry or fiction or nonfiction, essays, photography, social media? There's a lot of art that is being created on social media right now that's amazing.
Absolutely.
Does that give you hope? Or what are some thoughts you have in terms of seeing that there's still so much good and young people are doing a lot of extremely powerful things?
Honestly, young people generally today give me hope. I feel like, frankly, they're doing a lot better than my generation is doing. And that's broadly across the board. And I think even facing all of the mistakes that my generation has made that they're going to have to deal with. Whenever I am talking to students, and I'm not saying this to pander to all of you, this is honestly what I think. Whenever I'm talking to students who are in high school or in college now, I get the sense that they're thinking about these issues much more deeply than certainly I did when I was their age, and frankly, more deeply than a lot of people my own age are. They're really aware of all kinds of dangers that we're blithely not thinking about. I saw a poll yesterday talking about students with their feelings about AI, and that the students who are currently in high school and college now are much more skeptical about AI and much more concerned about the things that it might do that are bad for us, bad for society, bad for them, than my generation, who's like, cool, I need a recipe for a smoothie. Let me just ask ChatGPT and it'll make one up. There are many reasons, please don't do that. But in a sense, the generation that is coming up now, I feel like they're aware of the pros and cons in ways that the generations above them aren't. And they're also aware of all of the opportunities and all of the things that can happen that are good. They're making networks, they're organizing in ways that, again, my generation and the generation above me, who were the boomers, are sort of struggling to do right now. I think maybe because they're the ones who know that they're going to inherit the world and they want it to be better than the one that they're given, which frankly is not good. That gives me a lot of hope. And seeing them connect with each other and just be kind and share and tell their own stories and believe that their own stories are valuable, that gives me a huge amount of hope.
So also kind of going off something happening right now, in your view, what happens to these individuals or communities when their stories are ignored, erased, or just simply misunderstood?
I'm really glad you asked that, because I think we're in an era right now where a lot of stories people are attempting to erase a lot of stories. There's a lot of book bans happening around the country. I come from Boston, and even in Boston and around Massachusetts, book bans are an issue. It's not just Florida, Texas, southern states, it's all across the country. And what happens when you don't get those stories? Two things. We were talking about this idea of mirrors and windows earlier. One is that people don't get to see themselves. People don't get the affirmation of knowing that they're not the only ones out there. And you don't get windows into those worlds, meaning if you hadn't experienced those, one way that you might learn about that world or that culture is gone. The other thing is that when you take stories out of the library, if you say, okay, we're not going to have any books that involve any queer characters or any black characters or any people of color or maybe any women, we're only going to have the kind of books that fit what we think is the important, good stories. That's really the first step to erasing all of those groups of people. It's like saying, those stories don't matter, you're not important, you might as well not exist, we're not going to have your story in here. And so I think it's hugely important to protect having these stories there and having people be able to read them so that they can access those stories.
Well, with what Ben just asked and what you just shared in terms of we live in a time where books are very much in the forefront of our minds, whatever that topic is, whether it's book banning or we have a lot more diverse stories that we're seeing. And so curious to hear from your experience, because it's been just over a decade since Everything I Never Told You was published. Have you discovered any new emotions over the last decade? That's a big question, but 10 years is a long time, and not a long time depending on how you look at it. But what has it been like seeing your story out there and having gone through this very historical period of our time?
It's weird. It's weird. It's wonderful. I'm really happy that people are still reading this book and still finding meaning in it and still connecting to it. That is genuinely something that I never thought would happen. When I was writing Everything I Never Told You, I was an unpublished author. I was freelancing, so I was making very little money. And the only way I could get myself to write the book was telling myself, okay, you might as well just try and finish it because, like, you're probably never going to finish, so just try anyway. And once I had actually written it, I was like, well, even if you finish it, it's probably never going to get published. And even if it does get published, probably no one will ever want to read it, because who would care about this tiny little story about this one particular family? And I'm really happy that actually it seems like a lot of people have found parts of that story to be meaningful to them. So mostly, I guess the feeling I have is just gratitude, is like cheesy as that totally sounds. It's very strange to write something and then have it go out into the world and have people then come up and talk to you about those characters that you made up. Really early on, people would come up and talk to me about my book, and I would be really confused because it felt like they were coming up to me and talking to me about a dream that I had had, and I had forgotten that other people could hear that as well. But it has really been amazing to hear that, and I'm really proud of the book, and I want to thank all of you for reading it and thinking about it and spending some time with it. Great.
So what gives you hope right now when you look at young people using storytelling, art, or activism to create change? I
think I'm really hopeful because when I see the work of students today, whatever genre or field it's in, it feels to me like they're thinking about it in a really expansive and really human way. And what I mean by human is accepting that people are different and that difference is good and useful and valuable and interesting. Accepting that there are mistakes, that it's not going to be perfect, that it's not polished. It's something that comes out of your emotions. I see a lot of students writing about their experiences, and that makes me really happy too, because I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes. Nobody does, except for all of you. And I do firmly believe that everybody's story is important. And so I feel a lot of hope in seeing that students, I think, are writing and creating from that place of going, this is me, this is what I got, I'm going to put it out there, and it matters. It doesn't have to be the perfect commercially designed product. It's mine, and that's valuable. It sounds like such a small thing, but I think that's really important.
Well, I think it's often the small things that bring the big thing, right?
Yes.
I'm a believer of small joys that bring in the big joys. So
Absolutely.
I'm really glad you wrote the stories to share with us today. And with what you just said, have you ever thought about what you would tell your high school self? Because you just said that none of this was part of the plan, which happens most of the time, and it tends to be a good thing. But is there something that you would like to say to your high school self?
I've been thinking about this all morning because I was tipped off earlier that they were going to ask this question, and I was like, I actually don't know. I will say that whatever I tell myself, my high school self, I think my high school self would probably ignore. My high school self probably just would not believe anything that I had to say, because I think there are some things that you just have to experience to know. But what I would say for my teenage self to ignore is that you have to figure out what it is that you actually really care about and what it is that you really believe and what kind of person you want to be. And keep making your choices sort of moving you in that direction. So you don't have to have your whole future planned out. You don't have to necessarily know, okay, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go to grad school, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get this kind of job. All those choices you can make farther down the road. But if you know, okay, this is a thing I really care about. I really care about, for me, telling stories and trying to tell the stories that I have and trying to make space for other people to tell their stories as well. If I look back, I'm really happy to see that most of the choices that I made were sort of in service of that. We're like, well, how can I tell my story in the way that feels truest to me? And then if I have the opportunity, how can I pass the mic on to other people and make sure that they have that? I don't know what questions I'm going to have in the future. And, as a 15-year-old, I certainly would not have had any idea what choices I was going to make. But if I know kind of what direction I want to move in, it suddenly makes making those decisions easier. So I think that's what I'd say. Figure out what you care about and just keep moving towards that. And at every turn that you have, try and take the path that moves you towards that, and you will end up where you need to be. I firmly believe that.
It's funny, I didn't really think about that either until I asked you this question. As you was sharing, I was just thinking, I might tell myself that everything will be okay.
I mean, that's a good thing to remember, too. I think we need reassurance about that, because right now it definitely does not feel like things are going to be okay. But, I mean, what I tell my son, who is in high school right now, is history moves in cycles. And sometimes you're on a cycle where things are opening up. And right now, unfortunately, I think we appear to be in a cycle where things are contracting. There's less freedom, there's less openness, there's less opportunity, there's less availability. But you know that it is going to open up again, and what you can do is work towards that. And I hope it will open up in his lifetime, if not in my lifetime. That's kind of remembering that you're going to move in a cycle. We've been here before, and we're going to get through this.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We spoke with Celeste Ng, New York Times bestselling author of Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere. Up next, we hear from more Simsbury High School students who work to amplify Asian American voices across Connecticut through an oral history and documentary project called Make Us Count. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. When students at Simsbury High School discovered that there was little to no data on Asian American students in Connecticut, they launched a project to change that. Seniors Raylan Medina, Vivian Amsterdam, and Driti Malarapu collected oral histories from Asian American voices across Connecticut for an oral history project called Make Us Count. The effort was led by Michelle Henry. She's an English and Asian American studies teacher at Simsbury High School who developed the project with students. I asked Raylan how this project got started.
We were doing just like a regular assignment in class one day, and we were looking at the data that was getting reported from school systems. And so this is public data. Everyone can see it. You can just go online and see what's getting reported to the state. And we noticed that in some school systems, there was a high population of Asian American students. And if we went to, say, the absentee list or the suspension list or other things, they just weren't represented at all. And there wasn't a section for them. It didn't say 0. It just wasn't there. And I think seeing that just made us realize that there was such a misinterpretation about the way that Asian American students are represented in our community. And seeing that, we felt like we had to do something. We had to, find people and figure out what was going on and why they weren't represented at all.
And Vivian, how did you all react when you realized that there was so little data on Asian American students?
It was really shocking to me because I've spent a lot of time in honors classes, AP classes. I've taken APUSH, AP US History, and it's something that we never really touched on, but I never noticed because there's this kind of invisibility of the Asian American community. We never really focused specifically on Asian American history. And so when I was seeing this data, it really made me reflect on how little I had learned about this entire community throughout my entire school career. So we were all just really shocked. And I think that was why we were so motivated to start this project, because it's such an important topic to be discussing.
Well, I think it's amazing that you all looked at the data and realized that something needs to be done. So, Raylan, how did you go from looking at the data, things that are on paper, to wanting to put that absence into action, and that action created the idea of recording oral history? Yeah,
so we were sitting there and we were looking at all this data, and I remember someone in the class just said, we have to do something. We can't sit here and see this and just move on and never do anything about it. And even if it doesn't have a crazy big impact, and even if it doesn't, change immediately, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for people to see what we've done and see the representation that we're trying to get for these students and, turn it into something that could change the way that people are represented in our community. And I think like seeing all of this, we decided that we just had to move forwards with it, and we had to like discover new things and learn stories from people that could change the way that people view the Asian American community.
And Dhriti, how did you find people to interview? Share with us the type of experiences that you're hoping to capture with this.
Absolutely. It was mostly guidance from our teacher, Miss Henry. She has so many connections with so many different people. I got to go to this amazing celebration run by APAC, the Lunar New Year event, and I got to talk to just so many different people. There were just politicians, students there. It was just a whole group of just so many diverse stories that I could really understand, and I could get just so many perspectives on. And it was just so great to add them to our documentary because we're trying to showcase different stories. So it's just so important to showcase their different experiences, and we can only do that by talking to these different people.
And so, Raylan, what type of questions did you ask? Was there a specific experience or a specific sort of vibe that you're hoping to capture with this?
Yeah, so I think it depended on, who we were interviewing. We had a list of questions and kind of altered them as we went. If somebody was from Connecticut, if someone went to a certain school system, we kind of like twisted the questions in that way to be as if like they went to, say, Simsbury High School, or they went to a different high school. We would be like, what was the community like there? Did you feel represented? Did you see yourself throughout the community? What was it like living in that town? And I think what was most important to us was finding out what it was like in different places, because when you look at things like this, you can't just see data and be like, that's just the data. You have to realize that there's communities there, and you have to learn about those communities to be able to see and like figure out what you can change about that, because we don't all go to Simsbury High School. We don't all see the same things every day. So I think like the questions that we were asking were more about like what it was like for those people either growing up or what it's like currently while they're growing up.
And Dhriti, you were able to interview and talk with someone named Devani Do. Tell us about that experience.
So she came to our school, and it was a great experience just seeing her in person and hearing her story. She's a Vietnamese refugee that came here in her teens, and she overcame just so much hardship. And it was great to talk to her about her experience coming to America just by herself and learning how to adapt and be a high school student, but also just a person who went through so much grief and so much trauma. Talking to her was really incredible. I loved hearing her story, and I really hope I get to talk to her again.
Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned it was so exciting to hear from her, but what was it like hearing stories like that? And of course, she's not the only one, but you've talked to so many. But what went through your mind as you were hearing her story?
I just really was like trying to talk to her about what was happening through that process. And when I hear her experience and other people's experience going through something like that, it really puts me in their shoes. And I really understand like how trauma can really affect someone like that, and how deep it can penetrate, and how it impacts their children or their future lives, even though the trauma has passed, but it still stays latched onto someone.
And of course, that is still very present for many in the community. And you've also interviewed a few students. Here, we're going to hear from Haritha Subramanian. She is a UConn student ambassador and APAC secretary, and she's here to talk about mental health.
I remember telling my dad that I wanted to explore a diagnosis for ADHD because I had the symptoms. It was affecting my academics. It was affecting the way that I live. And he basically told me that he couldn't raise a broken child. That wasn't something that he could do, which is unfortunate. And it just kind of speaks to the stigma that our community has around neurodivergency and focusing on mental health.
Vivian, could you respond to what we just heard from Haritha?
Of course. I think that really goes back to something that we've talked about a lot in our Asian American Studies class, which is the model minority myth and invisibility, where it kind of creates this pressure that you have to always be perfect. You have to live up to these unrealistic expectations. And because of that, mental health is a really big issue in the Asian American community that's often not really discussed. There's kind of a stigma that you shouldn't be struggling with your mental health. You shouldn't ask for help. You shouldn't look for support like therapy. And I think Haritha's experience really speaks to that, kind of the stigma that she faced from her own family when she tried to reach out and ask for help. And we've seen a lot of statistics, like in 2019, suicide was the leading cause of death for Asian American youth, and that was the only racial group where that was true. And that's just something that you don't really hear about often enough, and I think it needs to be talked about more.
And it feels like oftentimes these conversations are not to say there's always a purpose, but oftentimes it's to break barriers, it's to break stigma, and it's to sort of open up conversation, not just with people in the community, but outside of it. Raylan, when you were working on this project, what were some other people that stuck out to you?
So someone who definitely stuck out to me was Megan Baker. She is the Asian American Pacific Islander, representee for our state. And when speaking to her, we first started off with a presentation that she actually gave to community members of our state. And she talked about the data that we saw. And she talked about how if you dig deeper and you see this data and you want to learn more, you can actually find where Asian American students are represented in our community. And you can see where the data that was missing, and you can find that. And I think talking to her and seeing that she could find the data if you dig deeper, I think that really showed me that there's so much more that could be represented. And I think that made it so confusing for me because I didn't understand why, if the data was out there, it wasn't represented. And I didn't understand why, if any other group of people, if other groups of people can be represented in that way and can be shown in the data, why can't Asian American students? And like Vivian was talking about before, like this really goes back to the model minority myth of these students are perfect. They're perfect. They have to be perfect. They're great at math. They're great in school, and they're quiet and they're shy. And I think the data speaks to so much more than just being numbers. And that was really shown in Megan Baker's interview. And then talking to her separately after that and doing an interview with her, you also realize that the people that are standing up for this have their own stories and they had their own experiences. And you have to learn that to be able to get the whole truth and the whole story.
We just heard from Rayla Medina, Vivian Amsterdam, and Dhriti Malarapul. Before graduating from Simsbury High School in June, they collected oral histories from Asian Americans for the Make Us Count documentary project. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.